Nevertheless, when good enough is really good enough. And so my purpose here tonight is when you walk away, that perhaps you'll have a different idea about the term good enough. When we hear the term good enough, we usually think of okay, average, adequate, getting by. And in this context, in the psychological context that I'm going to talk about it tonight, good enough really can be great. I'm going to talk about what happens when our desire for perfection and our perfectionistic behavior actually gets in our way of achieving excellence. And in fact, a good enough environment, which I'm going to introduce you to, a good enough environment, or what is known as a good enough facilitating environment, actually is a better avenue to achieving excellence. So these kinds of paradoxical statements, I hope, will make some sense to you after we finish. But like the good psychologist that I am, to begin, it all starts with your mother. It all begins in our earliest relationships. And that's where the term good enough really comes from, because it draws from the notion of the good enough mother. And this idea, and again, by the way, these slides are going to have a lot of quotes on them. I'm not going to read all of them to you. If anybody wants them, if you want the slides, I can make it available to you. But I know some of you are going to be looking back and forth, looking up there and then looking at me, but that's perfectly fine. But I just wanted you to start, that the guy who really started this was a guy named D.W. Winnicott, Donald Winnicott, who was a British psychoanalyst who worked with children, who observed children and their families very, very closely. And he said, in the earliest stages of life, really, there's no, to an infant, there's no difference between themselves and their mother. It's just one big, wonderful experience where they feel absolute connection to the mother. And then after a while, the mother learns to adapt to the child's needs. In the beginning, those of you in the audience that are mothers, you probably know this. In the beginning, that a mother pretty much tends to every need of the child. The child is totally dependent. She creates something known as a holding environment. And she literally holds the child. And after a while, she learns to put the child down for a while. And as the child gets older, learns to walk, learns to talk, becomes more of a functioning self, she learns to back off a little bit and tries to find that balance point. It's a precarious point. You don't know exactly where it is. But that balance point between providing some control and also providing some autonomy for the child. And the better she does that, she creates what is known as a good enough facilitating environment. I will explain that a little bit more carefully. David Brooks picked up on this. Some of you might know David Brooks, who writes for the New York Times. In his book, The Social Animal, says that parents really don't have to be brilliant psychologists. They don't. In essence, one of the nice factors about this is that parents don't have to be perfect, as much as they might try. In fact, it's even better when they don't. But he said instead, parents just have to be good enough. That they have to provide their kids with stable, predictable rhythms, so that the child understands some combination of warmth and discipline, and finding the balance in between. That's what being a good enough parent actually is. In fact, I will quote, I've got this, I could explain it to you, but if I read it to you the way I wrote it, because it took me a long time to get this down the way I wanted it. So I'm just going to read a paragraph or two to you, just first of all, so you'll get a feel for what this is. But I think this explains it fairly well, just so we know what it is. The good enough mother has the capacity to observe and question her own actions and potential shortcomings, and to respond with empathy to the needs and emotional reactions of her growing child. She can suspend her certainty about what is happening in the child's developing inner world and remain open and responsive to his experiences, including his struggles and expressed frustrations with her inevitable failures. Okay, now we're not saying that mothers fail their children, but the times when she is not available at that exact moment that the child might need, or when the child gets frustrated and she can respond with empathy. As this mutual process evolves and elaborates over time, this good enough mother recognizes that ultimately she cannot and should not be all and do all. By acknowledging her limitations, she sends an implicit message that her child is a separate and unique person in relation to her and can claim a measure of personal freedom and ownership of his internal world which he may in turn choose to share with others, and that sets the stage for this child to develop healthy relationships both with the mother, the father, other siblings, and also as the child grows with others in his or her world. So how does this break down for us? It means this, basically, that it means letting go of perfection. We live in a perfectionist society. I mean, every day you see top tens, you see rank orderings. Just the other night we saw the Academy Awards. We want to know what's the best. We want to know what's the best, and we are constantly in search of excellence. Ever since the Peters and Waterman came out with the book in 1982, that we've been searching for excellence. And honestly, we find a version of it, but we don't necessarily find perfection. But we seem to want to do that. And I know I'm on comfortable territory here, especially knowing the work that Diane does, and to an extent others, that we live in an age now of helicopter parents. You know, we lived in an age, Vicki knows exactly what we're talking about, of helicopter parents who, as well-intended as they are, and they do this out of love, they really do, but they overmanage their kids. They try to create these little perfection, perfect little, what do we call perfect little achievement machines. And what happens is, and what Winnicott says, that the more the parents, out of perhaps insecurity, just not knowing exactly what to do at the right moment, and also wanting the very, very best for their child, which all parents do, that what they end up creating is something that Winnicott referred to as a false self. That the good enough environment actually creates a more authentic self because the child feels free to get angry. The child feels free to fuss. The child feels free to express some frustration and anger that he's not getting exactly what he wants or she wants at exactly the right time. And the mother can respond, and then they can negotiate. They can actually, any of you have children that learned to negotiate when they were about 2? They learn the importance of the word no. And they understand that they can put a stake in the ground and say, this is mine, that's yours, this is me, this is you. And they don't create this overly compliant false self that can't handle things when things start to go wrong. And those of us that are in education know that that's been a theme. The other, and it's indicative of the weather too, another term that we hear in the media now is something called snowplow parents. Now we've seen a lot of snowplows in the last few weeks. But if you can imagine that metaphor for parents, these are the parents that jump out ahead of their children and clear the pathways and clear all obstacles out of the way so that their child never experiences an obstacle and never experiences anything. And so they sort of live in this sort of perfect little bubble, but they don't understand exactly how to lose or how to not get exactly what they want at the right moment, and it creates all kinds of havoc for academic administrators. So this means a good enough environment actually means letting go of perfection. It actually means emotional intelligence. It means learning to manage emotions, learning to understand emotions, learning to put those emotions to use in a positive way. And it's about things like facilitating, responding, and adapting. And that's what happens in this early stage, and we hope that happens throughout life. Actually, this is not a new concept. Winnicott put it in terms that psychoanalysts use, but quite honestly, if all of us can think a little bit more like artists, poets, musicians, painters. So I have here a collection of some quotes that I've collected, some, pardon me, that are in the book, and some that I've added, and I go over these in my classes with my students, obviously from Voltaire, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Many of you might have heard that. From Yo-Yo Ma, hero of mine, wonderful, absolutely wonderful musician. Musicians, and Diane and I go to the symphony a lot, and many of you know that we're heavily involved with the symphony. We talk to some of the musicians, we get to know some of the musicians, and they will be the first ones to tell you, as wonderful as the Boston Symphony sounds, and as perfect as you might think they're playing, they know when they get it right and when they don't, and what happens when they don't, and often they don't. Okay, and Yo-Yo Ma, this is a quote from a New Yorker article that was written about him a long time ago, almost 30 years ago, when he was very much younger. And he said, when he was young, he really concentrated on playing every note perfectly. But he said, then I looked out into the audience and realized that not only is the audience bored, but I myself am bored. And that's what I'm communicating to the audience. And he said, here, perfection is not very communicative. You know, he said, whenever you subordinate your technique to the musical message, that then you can get really involved with the audience. It doesn't matter if you miss a note or two or don't play it exactly the way you intended to play it in practice, but it comes across, and what comes across, any of you that have ever watched Yo-Yo play, his entire personality comes across, his entire emotional life comes across through his cello and also through his face. Malcolm Lowe, who's the concertmaster of the Boston Symphony, who is also an avid golfer and an extremely good golfer. I've never played with him. I would be put to shame by him. I think he has a Stradivarius driver. But he had a quote, I think this was in the Globe, that playing golf is actually a lot like playing the violin. You know, he said getting close to perfection, but never, ever, achieving it. The Japanese have this term wabi-sabi. I don't know if any of you have heard of wabi-sabi. It sounds like something you get at a sushi restaurant. But the reality is it's this Zen-like experience, this understanding of our relationship to nature and the understanding and appreciation that nature is imperfect. It's impermanent and it's incomplete. And this guy, Leonard Cohen, has applied this to artists. And this is basically the way that artists employ this basic attitude. I know there's some artists and writers in the room. You know, when is the poem complete? When is it perfect? When do you stop? When do you stop painting? Okay, when does a composer say, okay, that's it, it's the Fifth Symphony, sounds pretty good, I think I'm done. When do you stop perfecting it? And I think that's something that, and I'm not an artist, I like to think of my teaching as a form of artistry, but I think artists think this way. Michael Pollan, many of you know Michael Pollan is writing about food, but I read this wonderful book that he wrote called A Place of My Own, where he set out to and did build a writing structure for himself in his home in Connecticut. And he was writing about the experience of it. And he said, you know, I took heart in what I'd read about the arts and crafts movement's liberal line on mistakes. He said, there's hope in honest error. That one designer had declared, none in the icy perfections of the mere stylist. That small mistakes in the finished product actually reveal the hand of the worker. Perfection was opaque. You know, that the real meaning comes true actually in the imperfection. Twyla Tharp, choreographer. Again, and I don't want to read the entire thing to you, you can read it on your own. But in the creative process, when she wrote in her autobiography called The Creative Heart, the good planning alone, you know, won't make your efforts successful. It's important to plan, but it's only after, the paradox is you have to plan and plan out the perfect, you know, the perfect dance or the perfect piece or whatever you want to do, but it's only after you let all that go, okay, that the real value comes through and it breathes life into your efforts, as she says. Cate Blanchett, many of you saw her just Sunday night at the Academy Awards. I don't know what or who she was wearing, but the red carpet is, again, our brush with perfection. She says, I don't like everything to be tied neatly in bows. She said, if it's flowing, you don't arrest it. And I think she speaks for many actors that really what they're getting at is something that's fluid. This is too long, I'm sorry, but I admire this quote from Anne Morrow Lindbergh so much, and the idea of fluidity, that she talks about the ebbs and flows of life and relationships. She's afraid, you know, she said, we leap at the flow of the tide and resist in terror its ebb. We're afraid it'll never return. We insist on permanency, on duration, on continuity, when the only continuity possible in life, as in love, is in growth, in fluidity, etc. And then she applies it to dancers. And finally, just putting this into practice, into common practice, this article appeared in the Boston Globe right around the time I wrote my book, so it was really well placed and highly valued when I saw it. But Catherine Schultz, writing about mistakes and the importance of mistakes and how we approach mistakes. And I think anybody that works in business, anybody that works in any kind of enterprise, she said, we can demand that our business and political leaders acknowledge and redress their errors rather than ignoring or denying them. When we set up, I mean, the issue is when we set up this culture of perfection, we actually set up a culture of cover-ups. You know, because nobody ever wants to admit a mistake. We've seen mistakes in the last few weeks. And how we handle them. And, we live in sort of the zero tolerance kind of world. And I said, yeah, even honestly, yeah, you want, Diane just had surgery on her wrist. You want that to be perfect. You did want that to be perfect, right? She wants that to be perfect, of course. But we've talked to surgeons, and some of you might know surgeons, and sometimes they make a mistake, or they don't do it precisely the way it was supposed to be done. They might have to redo something, or there's a back and forth there. But a lot of times, there's some states that are passing what are known as I'm sorry laws, to reduce the number of lawsuits, for simple mistakes, that are made. Now, sometimes, as I said, and I quote in the book, sometimes I say, sometimes it really is brain surgery, sometimes it really is rocket science. But most times it's not. And even then, there's room for, as what was said before, for honest error. And once we can, she said, a better relationship with wrongness, she says, can lead to better relationships in general, whether between family members, colleagues, neighbors, or even nations. And so I run out of quotes, so I'll just have to start quoting myself now. So I saw this in terms of management. I teach management. I teach sort of a cross between management. I teach interpersonal relations and management. And years ago, I sort of had this idea of the good enough mother. That was when I was doing some training in psychotherapy, and I was learning this new craft, which I never actually formally practiced, but it was fun to learn, and applied it. I ended up applying it to the classroom. I ended up applying it to teaching. But when I learned about Winnicott, when I was taking some classes at the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute, and also at the Boston Institute for Psychotherapy, there was something about Winnicott's work that just resonated with me. This idea of the good enough mother, this whole notion of good enough. And it brought, when I introduced it in my classes, it kind of brought relief to a lot of people that, oh, well, I don't have to be perfect. I can, and good enough doesn't mean mediocre. Good enough means creating a good enough facilitating environment. So I said there's a natural connection between this good enough process and what I called good enough managing and good enough managers. It's not that much different, to be perfectly honest. You're still in an ongoing interaction with people. They're not your children. Sometimes they behave that way, but they're not your children. They can be childish, however, and some of those early interactions reverberate throughout our other relationships, including our other relationships as adults with authority. Anybody that's ever been in an authority position knows that. And so I just made the leap and just said, is there such a thing as a good enough manager? And how does that person work? And how do they do their jobs? And that's what I've been teaching essentially for the last 35 to 40 years. Good enough managing, the process is not the same as good enough performance. Okay, that just good enough is not. It's actually excellent performance. One does not let go of the quest for excellence. Rather, it's more the letting go of the perfectionist behavior that can stifle creativity and ultimately impede the way to better performance. That's the crux of the book. That's basically the whole premise. And so I defined a GEM, a good enough manager. And it was a nice fortuitous acronym that I discovered when I was in China. I don't know why, but I was in China and I had a lot of time on my hands. Vicki remembers this. Diane certainly remembers this. I was on a class experience over in China. Greg Hall remembers this. And because he was laughing at me because when I was writing him emails saying, I don't have a lot to do over here, Greg. And so I had a lot of downtime. So I was doing a lot of reading and I was doing a lot of thinking. And that's actually where I sketched out the book. And I just scribbled out on a piece of paper and I said, good enough manager. And it was then that I saw the acronym GEM. And then all of a sudden the whole thing came together and I had the making of a GEM. This is my definition, my carefully crafted definition, imperfect definition of what I call a good enough manager. One that is confident working with fluidity, complexity, and uncertainty. We certainly have a lot of that. And any manager that can't handle that has no business being in that role. They build and maintain very effective relationships by managing emotions and communicating clearly and genuinely. And they facilitate things like autonomy, maturity, creativity, and growth, the same things that young mother was doing with her child. The same basic sense, except it's just writ large in another setting. And so I decided to go out and study this. I decided to go out and collect some data. And I created this study, and because I was at Bentley, and I'd been at Bentley for a very long time, I knew people in alumni relations. Hell, I certainly knew a lot of alumni. And I said, what would it mean? How could I get access to our alumni database? What if I just wanted to send out like a blast email? I didn't want to, I was really just wanted to, I just wanted to collect some stories, is really what I wanted to do. I didn't really set out to do a really highfalutin study, you know. I mean, I wanted to publish something, but I was writing a book, and I said, you know, I don't care if it gets published in the Journal of Applied Psychology or whatever journal. I would rather just get some stories, and I want to add some life to these ideas. And so what if I just sent out an email and do what I do all the time in my class, and that is tell me about the best manager you ever worked for. Just a segment of my class. Tell me about the best manager, best boss you ever had, and tell me about the worst manager you ever had, and just describe them. You know, don't tell me who they are. I don't really need to know who they are or where they work or anything like that. I'm really just interested in the essentials. I'm really just interested in the behavior. So tell me what they do and tell me what they don't do. And so I sent out this. They made arrangements for me to do it. I sent it out completely. It was anonymous. They could just go to this website and they could write a story. They could provide a narrative. They could provide a description. And it's amazing. I was hoping to get a couple hundred. I ended up getting well over 1,000, actually technically 1,058. And that was a lot of stories to read. Some were short, and others wrote me long paragraphs. And because it was Bentley, half of them were in the financial world, you know, in financial public accounting and IT organizations, and the rest were scattered about in different kinds of businesses. And I did a textual analysis. You know, I did a computerized contextual analysis and highlighting the themes and the most frequently used terms. And it's an iterative process. I won't go into detail about it here. I don't even go into that much detail about it in the book. But it's, first of all, I did my own analysis, and I just read every single one of the stories. And I just started coding them. You know, I just started putting them in categories. And just seeing, and it was very interesting what started to emerge. And then in addition to that, I did the formal textual analysis that the computer generated, and then just started putting things into categories. And after a while, it begins to tell a story. So I'll show you the results. The results are rather interesting in relation to the theory. Anybody have a clue or an idea about what might be ranked at the top? Those of you that have read the book, don't cheat. Anybody have an idea what might have come up as the top couple of qualities in a manager that makes for the best manager? Honesty. Sounds good. Nice. Okay. Depends how we define nice. What?
Gets out of the way.
Gets out of the way. What do you mean by gets out of the way, Christopher? The stories around these were wonderful. Some of the ones that wrote glowingly about these people, that they had that created a learning environment for them. And then on down, honesty is in there. It's down there. These are the tops. It's down near the bottom there, but these were the top 10 or 15 in order. But they were supportive. Where you said did not micromanage. That's basically the way they said what you just said. That they provided autonomy. And remember, going back to the earliest phases of life, that good enough mother basically provides that child in his own world a measure of autonomy. Okay, she doesn't just sit him down and say, just go off and do whatever you want to do. But you know, I'll be over here, you play over there. And if you ever watch a child play in the mother's presence, but the mother's not overly involved with what the child is doing. The child's over there making up stories. The child's over there, you know, creating these relationships among objects. The child is actually having a good time, and in a relatively safe environment. Respect, trust, listen, open. These are things that I teach in an interpersonal relations class. These are the themes that come out. For the worst managers, what do you think was number one? Worst manager trend. What? There it is. There it is in all of its glory. Micromanager. The stories that I got around these were interesting. I'm going to share one or two with you just so you can get a flavor. There's tons of stories. There's tons of stories in the Naked City. Those of you remember that. But there's tons of stories in here around each one of the themes. But a lot of these are just the mirror opposite of what you saw earlier, except for a couple. This takes credit. There's one of the things that they take credit. It was an interesting combination. They take credit for things that other people do and then blame people for what they do. That was a very common theme. You can see blame down a little further down the list. They were untrustworthy. They didn't give good feedback. They were often condescending in their communication, condescending, arrogant in their communication. They were poor listeners. Sometimes they played favorites. They were insecure. These are actual words, and what you see are the number of times that those were used in descriptions. These are the ones that are used repetitively. So let me just give you a couple of examples, and we can wrap this up in a few minutes, and then if you want to have some discussion around any of the things that I've brought up, I would certainly welcome your comments and your questions. I concluded that the gems, and I like the term gem because a lot of said my boss is a gem, and this is what a gem is, that I said that they were mentors and teachers, they were relationship builders, and they were models of integrity. And again, they knew what they were doing, but a lot of times, we assume that people knew the technicalities of their job. But it's interesting when you ask the person, every once in a while they said the boss was smart, every once in a while they said knew his stuff or her stuff, but most of the stuff that they wrote about were the interactive factors, the human factors, the stuff that I've been teaching for a number of years. So it was very heartening for me to see this. And just an example, again, there are too many words here, I apologize for that, but I wanted to give you the whole thing, so I highlighted some of it. And this was the one, I think, out of all 1,058, I think this is the one that kind of nails it. I think this is the example. It said, the best manager I worked for was one who gave me autonomy and trusted me to perform, exactly what Christopher just said. And again, had to prove myself. He gave me tasks, framed them by sharing a vision and a goal. He gave me the goal, set the guardrails or the boundaries. Okay, and then if ever I was near one of those guardrails or the boundaries, they would kind of steer me back over, but they didn't micromanage me. They didn't tell me what to do moment by moment. I knew they were there. I knew that they supported me. I knew I could go to them with questions. I knew that they would hold me accountable. But the reality is they kind of got out of the way, but we're close enough by that if I needed them to come back in, that they would. And there is sort of this, if you look at the Anne Morrow Lindbergh quote, there is sort of this ebb and flow going on here. That really, and we've taught leadership. Vicki has taught we've taught leadership over the years, and the best leaders are ones that adapt their leadership style to the situation that's confronting them. So in a crisis, when the tea's not running, when we've got the biggest snowfall we've ever had in the century, in times like that, we expect leaders to step in, and we expect leaders to be more, on top of things, and how they do it, but we do expect more than that. We didn't say, hey, I give you the money, manage it the best way you can. But in normal circumstances, most of the time, they know how to let go. They know how to back off. And some managers are much better, the more experience that they get, I think instinctually they know when to hold on and they know when to back off. Here's one that I'll just share with you. This is a micromanager. The person said, one manager I worked for used to comment about the time on which I log on to Instant Messenger as an indication for when I started working. They tracked them on Instant Messenger. And then the other manager for whom I worked remotely was frustrated he did not know where I am at any given time and asked me to install a webcam on my desk so he could see me all day. So those of you that telecommute, those of you that work from home, you can imagine what that working for that boss must be like. I think there's an element of stalking in that. So I'm just going to conclude about, well, how do you become one of these? I said, are these gems just sort of these rare people that just sort of walk among us and every once in a while you find one? But the reality is, can you actually become one? I mean, are there skills that you can learn? Are there things that you can do? And I said, yeah, part of it is your attitude. Part of it is, whatever emotional equipment that you have and that you put into practice. But there are a lot of things that you can do in order to become more of a gem. And I put them in the form of 4 C's, so they're easy to remember. And I call it capacity, competence, character, and commitment. And capacity is probably the hardest, and in many cases, I think one of the most important. You first of all have to have this ability to let go. I mean, you have to have this willingness, not only empathy, an understanding of what's going on with the people that you're working with and working for you, but also the ability to kind of know when and be willing to back off. And it's not easy for a lot of people to do, particularly really smart people that have a lot of answers and know a lot of things. It's very difficult to put yourself in that vulnerable position of just sort of backing off and letting somebody else take the reins. And obviously, competencies that you can develop around this, such as listening and assertive communication, constructive confrontation, these are all the things that are taught and that I've been teaching for years. And then there's an element of character, that these were managers who did the right thing. These were managers who had values. These are managers that lived and worked by their values. And then finally, they sort of also had this passion and they had this purpose to what they did, sort of a visionary zeal when they put this into practice. And so you put all these together, and that's what you get. So that's basically my story. That's basically the study. It tends to uphold some of these ideas, and I think managers, I've worked with artists, I've worked with managers, I've worked with artists trying to manage and managers trying to manage artists, which is an interesting phenomenon. But I think managers can learn more of what we call the so-called right brain thinking that artists put into practice. This idea that perfection is not the goal. The perfection is an ideal, but it's not the goal. And that you can't drive people to perfection. You can create the circumstances, and the circumstances are known as a good enough facilitating environment so that people can find their way there. And achieve some really, really wonderful things in the process. So thank you. That's my formal part.